Thank you, everyone. Welcome today evening to Men's event. Today's is just a brief background. Today is the concluding episode of what was a four-part series called Transforming Agenda 2020, which Mint put together with Danfoss. And here I really like to special note of thanks to Danfoss. Ravi is present here, that they backed this project so wholeheartedly, and it's been a long journey and excellent one. Previously, we covered the subject areas of energy, food, and infrastructure. Today, we have picked up a extremely vexing agenda item, which is climate change. Probably a decade ago, we suddenly realized that it was something that would impact the Aam Aadmi. And that is what all of us have begun to feel. And there are two words now, catchphrase worldwide called global warming, but it's far, far more than that. With this in mind, we have an excellent panel of domain experts, and you will hear at length from them. So ladies and gentlemen, sit back and enjoy the conversation.
Moving on now, ladies and gentlemen, it's time for us to invite on stage Dr. Rajat Kathuria, the Director and Chief Executive from Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations, to join us on stage to deliver the keynote address for all of us.
Before I start talking on the subject, let me thank profusely Mint and, of course, Anil, an old friend, and Danfoss Ravi for organizing this work. We pride ourselves as an institution that provides evidence-based inputs to policymakers so that they can take informed decisions, both at the state level as well, of course, at the center. I think climate change and a couple of other issues like urbanization did not find mainstream sort of focus on the economic policy-making agenda in India until, almost maybe a decade ago or a decade and a half ago. They were, at best, peripheral to the agenda, because India's agenda really was about how do you create growth, and how is that growth going to affect the people, how are you going to create jobs, how are you going to have distributional equity, and how is agriculture, industry, and services, that structural transformation that we talk about so often in India that has gone wrong. That was really the economic agenda at the Planning Commission that was really paramount, that was privileged in some sense over the other agendas like urbanization and climate change. It was imperative that we recognized that the economic agenda could not be looked at in isolation from both the climate change agenda as well as the urbanization agenda. And I'm really happy now there's a fair amount of integration between what we do in the economy as economists, what we do, and what we do as climate change scientists, what we do as urban planners, and how we plan our urbanization. There is a multidisciplinary approach to the problem of economic policy making. We in ICRIER, in about 5-6 years ago, we became a part of a consortium which is called the New Climate Economy, but it's a sort of a collaboration of 9 global kind of institutions funded by 9 different countries, and they all came together to try and think about how best it is to build a narrative around climate change that can actually distill down not only at the national level in various countries, but also at the subnational, regional, and of course municipal levels. And that narrative, it was important to change that narrative. And that narrative was that, very simply, that growth and climate are goals that cannot be achieved simultaneously. They are in conflict. You are beginning to change the narrative when you recognize that growth can actually begin to happen while you're also beginning to address your climate goals. This is an agenda that we need to resolve. Coal, carbon pricing is an agenda that we need to resolve. Thank you very much for listening to me. It's been a pleasure talking to you.
Now it's time for us to invite on stage Mr. Ravichandran Purushothaman, the President from Danfoss India, for a special address for all of us.
Good evening, everybody. Firstly, before I start, I would like to thank Anil and Swati for taking this journey from food to energy to infrastructure, and finally here culminating here in an important topic, which is climate change. As a company, I think we have evolved many of these technologies over the last 8 decades, and currently we work on 4 strategic agendas: clean water and sanitation, affordable and clean energy for all, sustainable cities and communities, and lastly, responsible consumption and production. I think in this context, I think we have created a factory in Chennai, which we are looking at making it carbon neutral in the next 5 years. Many of the narratives across the world about cooling is really the Cinderella of the energy debate. Why we say so? Because it is estimated that the world cooling energy requirement is going to grow 33-fold by the year 2100. And of course, we all know that air conditioning is a vicious cycle, because when you look at air conditioning, the traditional technology that exists for more than 100 years is compression of the vapors. When you talk about cooling today, we have fundamentally 3 parts to the vicious cycle. One is you need a lot of energy to actually run a cooling system. Second, that energy is basically using a lot of refrigerant. That refrigerant is actually throwing a lot of heat into the atmosphere. The third most important thing is that with more and more urbanization that is happening, we clearly see that more hot air is actually thrown in the cities. We at Danfoss are a firm believer that technologies like district cooling, technologies like using newer refrigerants, especially CO2, ammonia, we can actually disrupt a lot of the global warming potential that exists or that is going to be created by the future demand that comes up actually. I think India is clearly at a cusp where this inflection is going to happen in terms of urbanization. And I see climate change in India as a great opportunity, a global opportunity, and a potential game changer, which actually coupled with the Make in India objective that India has, I think we are poised to really become the manufacturing powerhouse for clean technologies for the world. And I think this is where we have a great potential to make a difference, not just to the economic development of India, but also, I believe, to make a difference to a cooler planet. Thank you very much.
Ladies and gentlemen, it's time to begin our panel discussion with industry experts on the topic India's climate imperatives.
I'm very thankful to this very distinguished panel for sharing this evening with us. This is absolutely a fabulous panel to discuss the issues of the day, challenges that India and the cities are facing. Without much further ado, I would like to introduce the panel and then dwell into some of the issues which have been talked about. So we have with us Professor J. Srinivasan, who's a distinguished scientist, Dveja Center for Climate Change at Indian Institute of Science. Dr. Jagdish Krishnaswamy, he's a senior fellow, Ashoka Trust for Ecology and the Environment. Thanks for being here. We have with us Ms. Ulka Kelkar. She's a senior climate policy lead, World Resources Institute, India. Last but not least, Mr. Aromar Ravi. He's a director in Institute for Human Settlements. My first, I'll be posing it to Professor Srinivasan. So your views on it?
First, I want to say a few words about a confusion that exists about climate. There are really 3 important issues. One is global climate change. The second is local climate change. And the third is environmental change. The 3 have to be treated separately because the kind of solutions you look for are different, depending on which you're talking about. But both in the media and among public as well as politicians, there's a confusion among them. Global climate change is something about which we in India cannot do much. We contribute 6% to the global CO2 emissions. So what we do or don't do in the next 20 years will hardly matter. The second is a local climate change, which in a city like Bangalore, we have seen dramatically. If we take the month of March, the mean temperature in Bangalore went up by 2 degrees centigrade. While at the same time, the global temperature went up by 1 degree. So half the warming of Bangalore was our own creation. And this can be solved locally. So the issue is again local, not global. I think I'll stop here. Thank you.
I would like Dr. Krishnaswamy to present his views.
Climate change would be very low in terms of the stressors that biodiversity faces. All our options would be closed if we actually do not remove the other stressors on biodiversity and ecosystems, which is the changes in land use and land cover. And even when we talk about mitigation, if you look at what's happening, so for example, large solar farms are being situated in semi-arid areas. And these are the last remaining habitats for a variety of species and for certain types of livelihoods and so on. When we talk about small dams in the Western Ghats, they are having tremendous negative impacts on native fish biodiversity. Real stressors is the lack is the disruption of the connectivity, the transformation of the landscape, which has very little to do with climate change. And so I think that before we start even thinking about what climate change is likely to do to our biodiversity and ecosystems, we need to think about the other stressors.
Mr. Ravi.
What I've heard my compatriots say just now, in some senses, is not very different from what you hear from other parts of the world, and that is that climate is not a significant issue. I would say that that's very, very far from the fact. And where am I saying that from? I've just spent 18 months leading a set of 70 authors to produce probably the most important report that will come out this year on climate change, in fact, on implementing the Paris Accord. So what are the facts? The first fact is that we are, from last year, 1 degree above the pre-industrial average. That's what the global average temperature is like. And exactly as Professor Srinivasan says, the local effects are significantly higher. As far as India is concerned, our temperatures, especially in cities, are significantly higher. Climate change is already here. It may not be here for 365 days of the year, but it's here for a certain number of days. And those number of days are actually increasing in time. So that's the mean average temperatures are growing at 0.2 degrees plus minus 0.1 degrees per decade, which basically means that we will have an overshoot over 1.5 degrees Celsius in a much shorter period of time than we thought of. We are headed, business as usual or otherwise, for an overshoot over 1.5. We don't know how long it will last, we don't know how much it will be, but that overshoot is almost certain. And that is why, and this is why I'm going to be a little contrarian here, climate is not only a local environmental issue, it's a global one, exactly as Professor climate change, at least at that scale, is very critical. For India, this is a national security question at one end. It's also a critical sustainable development question. The climate impacts that we expect to see here, if we don't make rapid change, not only in India but across the world, are of the order of displacement of hundreds of millions of people. This is a serious existential question, not only for enterprises, but for the existence of this country over the next 15 or 20 years.
Thank you. Scary thoughts there. I would like Ulka to weigh in here.
Yeah, thank you very much. So the way I was thinking about, listening to my fellow panelists, I see that there is a kind of two ways of thinking about it. One is you have India's climate imperatives that are the outcome of negotiation, so the Paris Accords and so on. And then there are imperatives that must come out as an outcome of our introspection. One thing that I would disagree with the way the sort of argument has been framed is I would like us to go beyond this sense of fear. Urgency is a very good thing. It's very good to feel that, but fear often leads us to wrong decisions. Out of, I think something like 14 thermal power plants reported that between 2013 and 2016, they had at least one shut down because of water shortages. And this led to revenue losses of 9,000 crores. The second point I want to talk about is rooftop solar photovoltaic. Again, solar has been a big success story. And rooftop solar photovoltaic makes sense for the consumers who install it on their rooftops. It makes financial sense. It makes ecological sense. So there is a very strong connection between low carbon emissions, energy efficiency, however you want to portray it or look at it, and social development.
What is the trade-off between environment and growth? That's a very important point. I would want to start with Aroma to weigh in there.
I think the whole framework of sustainable development that India is a signatory to actually helps reconcile those questions. The central question, like I just laid out just now, for us is a question of employment. It's a question of actual structural transformation of the economy. We are actually a very low carbon economy. So for us, in some senses, we have a great way to go if we don't actually hold on with both hands to a framework that doesn't work for us in some senses. And we are a low carbon economy with half the employment coming in the agricultural sector. So there are tremendous opportunities for us to transition. But the challenge for us, of course, is we are locked in at the current point of time into a coal-based energy system. So within that, our first and most important challenge is we have to end energy poverty. The second thing is you have to do that along with high degrees of energy efficiency. And there's lots of opportunity as far as that's concerned, and move to renewables. Because we're an economy that's growing so rapidly, and we're going to use a lot of physical goods and resources, there needs to be an industrial transformation so that even our industrial sector, whether it's cement or steel or otherwise, needs to decarbonize simultaneously.
I would like Professor Srinivasan to weigh in here. Sir, what is your views on this?
Increasing cooling load will generate more heat. Although that is true, but what people don't realize is the amount of waste industry produces today is 1/100th of the amount of heat trapped with CO2. One has to focus on controlling CO2 because that is much, much bigger than waste heat problem.
Right.
And the other issue that I would like to highlight here is that I think coal is a curse for India for two reasons. One is a low quality coal, second is under the forest, and we are removing forest to get the coal.
I would like you to come in, Dr. Jagdish.
The thing is that the other stressors that we have on our biodiversity and ecosystems are sometimes downplayed when climate change debates happen.
All right.
And if you ask any conservationist who works at the local or regional scales about what's the threat to aquatic biodiversity in India, what's the threat to some of our large mammals or of the great Indian bustard or for many of our endangered tree species, climate change will not immediately come to their mind. We have to continue working on those stressors in the long term for us to be able to adapt to climate change. The second thing is that we are seeing certain types of transformations that we have to manage. So India is getting urbanized a lot. Now, how do you manage biodiversity, especially biodiversity that needs to move from one patch of forest or one patch of habitat to another, when you have 8-lane highways, when you have cities and towns mushrooming all over. Right. So we really now need to think very smartly about how urbanization, linear intrusions, and biodiversity can coexist.
I would like Ulka to come in. Where do you see this conundrum finally settling down? Because there has to be a way out. It cannot be one of those esoteric debates all the time. It has to be some kind of a forward movement should be happening on it. There should be there's some traction somewhere. But in your view, where do you see this going?
I'd like to talk about two things at the two ends of the spectrum. So one is a lot of it is left to, say, those who are actually the most vulnerable. That is, if you leave it to the community, decentralization, for example. The second point I want to talk about is really, again, at the sort of larger end of the spectrum, which is the issue of behavioral changes or lifestyle changes. So how are we actually appreciating or understanding the aspirations of people and how those are changing, and using policies to actually design incentives that appeal to people's true motivations.
Thank you to our panel. Thanks a lot. Thanks for your time. And that brings to an end our Bangalore conversation. Thank you.